Okay, so we're going to practice using constraints. I'm going to explain all of them. I'm going to do it in a way that, well, we're going to try to create a train wheel. So first off, I'm going to create a cylinder. I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees. Do that. Okay, and this is going to be simplified, so you know. Okay, and we're just going to drive a piston. So I'm going to duplicate this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a orient constraint, maybe the most common of all the constraints. So it's driver driven. So we select the driver, and then we shift select and to select the driven. And then we're going to go to the constraint menu and orient, option box. And we're going to tell it, we can tell it to maintain offset or not. I'm not going to tell it to. And we can tell it which axes to control. We can manually set the offset if we want. X, Y, and Z. I've never seen a reason to do that. And you can control the weighting. Okay, so those are all your real important options. So we'll click apply. Okay, now if I go to the outliner, you can see that these two things are not parented to each other. I don't know, I'm a big fan of this hypergraph, so I'm going to show you in here. Okay, so these two objects are not apparent to each other. So this is the axle, and this one is the wheel. But if I rotate the axle, the wheel is going to rotate because it is constrained. Now if I grab the wheel and rotate it by itself, it will work until I adjust the timeline. Actually, they may have changed that, or maybe I just forgot something. Okay, so it appears to have saved my rotation of this wheel, but if I rotate this my goodness, if I rotate the axle again, it's going to reset the wheel. Okay, so we have the axle controlling the wheel. That's all we really cared for now. Okay, if I was to move this axle, you can see that it does not move the wheel. Okay, so now I want that wheel to follow the axle when I move the axle. So controller, Control E, driver driven, in the selections, go to constrain, we're going to go to point constrain, and we're going to tell it to maintain offset. Nah, we're not going to. I'll click apply, and then you can see that the wheel jumped to the pivot location of the controller, the axle. So that's not what we wanted. So we do want to maintain offset, and we'll click apply. And now there's still no parent-child relationship going on here, at least due to hierarchy. But if I move the axle, the wheel is going to move with it. And if I rotate it, the wheel is going to rotate. Okay. Now, let's create one more scenario. I'm going to create a little pin. Polygons, do a cylinder. Okay, and we want this pin to rotate with the wheel. So I'm going to create and now it's so we can have the driver driven. So let me rename this real quick actually. Pin driver driven. I'm going to go to constraint. This time I'm going to use parent. By default, parent is set to maintain offset. And it's going to control all the translates and all the rotates. And the weighting is 1. I'll explain the weighting here in a second. Remind me. So I'm going to click add. Now, when the axle rotates, the wheel is going to rotate. And when the wheel rotates or translates, the pin is going to rotate or translate. Okay, so it's kind of like we just parented them all. Okay. Now, here's something neat you can do with a, well, actually, no, I'm not going to show you that yet. Never mind. So I'm going to create an arm that will drive, let's say, a piston. So I'm going to go to create polygon primitives. This time I'm going to create a cube. Let me just move this out some. Now, if ever you find out you didn't have the objects in the driven object in the correct place at the time that you constrained it, then what you can do is you can move that object. Press Control-A to get your attribute editor. Go to the parent, go to the appropriate constraint, and then tell it to update. And that's going to update what are called the offset values. And now it's not going to try to jump back to where it was when you first constrained it. Okay, so now I'm going to switch into component mode. I'm going to grab this face. I'm going to make it an arm. Okay. Now, I want this arm to look like it's attached at this end, to the pin, right? So I'm going to grab the pin as the driver. I'm going to grab the arm as the driven. Maybe I should rename it real quick. Okay, so pin, arm. And you're going to go constrained, parent. Tell it to maintain offset, that's fine. Click add. Now, a lot of times, parent constraints are used, and this is where they're really powerful. Because right now, if I rotate this axle, it's going to rotate with it. But I just want it to be in that space, that location. So if I select this arm, and I grab these rotates, and break the connections there. Now, if I rotate the axle, which is controlling everything, I get more of a locomotive feel, right? So it keeps the right translation space. It follows when its controller object rotates, but it doesn't rotate itself. Question? The point constraint only works. Well, we can undo it real quick. Okay. So pin, arm, constraint, point. We'll tell it to maintain offset, add. Now we're rotating. And it looks like that works just fine, actually. They may have changed that. Huh. You used to have to do that specially. Darn it, I'm not as cool as I thought. It's okay. Good question. On video even. How shameful. Okay, so now we want this arm, though. We do want it to rotate because it needs to drive a piston. The steam is going to push on this arm and it's going to rotate the wheel, right? So we need this to drive a piston. So we're going to go create another object that we want to. Well, I'm just going to create a locator this time. Wrong thing. Locator. And we want this to aim at that. Okay. Go top view. Actually, top view. Okay. Now, back to perspective. So let's say this is where our piston is at. And we want this arm to point at the piston. So that's where we need an aim constraint. Now, aim constraints deserve a fair amount more time in their explanation. But it's still driver driven. But let's go ahead and do this for now. Okay, so there's no rotates. On the arm, at least no constraint for the rotation on the arm. So we're going to go to constrain, aim, option box, and I'm going to give a quick overview of what's going on in here. It has the maintain offset and the offset values just like the other constraints. We have an aim vector. That is the direction you want the object to point. Okay, so to double check this, you'll want to make sure that you're in object mode. And Z is pointing out opposite the direction I want the arm to point. So I need to change this aim vector to X is to 0, Y is to 0, and Z is being -1. Okay, now the up vector is the direction I want it to be up on this arm. So up is the positive Y, the green handle pointing up. And then we're just going to use the world up type and leave that set to vector. I'll show you in a minute that we actually want to change this to object up. Okay, and the world up vector is a positive Y. So we have our positive Y of the object is going to point to positive Y of the world. Okay, we're going to constrain all axes. Then we'll click add. And now the arm points at that locator. So if I grab my axle, rotate it, then I've got a choo-choo train sort of effect. Okay, kind of handy. Now, what happens if I parent all these? Everything. And I rotate this upside down. Look what's happening to that arm. The world up, the Y of this object is trying to point to the world's Y. Now, a lot of times your character is going to be bending all over the place. Maybe he falls down. So if you've used world Y as your up vector, then this is not going to work. So we need to change how we control that. So this is an important piece you don't want to miss. Okay. So we actually need a third object. So I'm going to grab this locator. We call this aim constrainer. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to move this up and over above this arm. Okay? And it doesn't have to be real precise. I just need it above the arm. Now, I need to rename this. I'm going to call this aim constrainer underscore up. Okay, so now driver driven, I'm going to select my aim constrainer and my arm. Go to constraint, aim, option box, and I can leave everything the same except I don't want this world up type to be vector. I want it to be object up, in which I can give it a name. I can tell it what is the world up object. So it is aim constrainer underscore up. Okay, now I can click apply. And this arm points to that locator just the same as it did the first time. Works just the same as it did the first time. But now, if I had a real more rigger-like scenario, and I grab all these and group them so I can have a nice hierarchy, and I rotate this group, that arm is going to stay put. It's not going to try to rotate and match the world's up Y. It's always going to look at this locator. So I can move this locator and change which direction that arm rocks to. In the case of a train wheel, you would never want that to change, unless your train was falling apart, I guess. So what I would normally do is I hide that locator so it can't be seen. It still belongs to the group or your main control if you're on a character. And I can rotate this, and nothing's broken because I created my aim constraint correctly. Ugh. Okay. Now, there's one last thing I can do. I can have the scale. I can use a scale constraint. So I'm going to have the axle scale can drive the wheel scale. So constrain, scale. We'll go to the option box. Maintain offset. Yeah. Click apply. We'll have the wheel drive the pin. Apply. We can have the pin drive the arm. Apply. And we could go on and so forth. Now, normally you wouldn't do it that way. I'm just showing you that it's possible. Normally, if the axle is going to change size and we know that everything needs to be the same size with it, and for some reason we needed to use a scale constraint rather than just parenting it, then you would probably have the axle drive all of the different objects, or the wheel, or whatever is the most central piece. Really, you just want it to make sense. Okay, so I created all those. And if I switch to my scaling tool now, everything's going to scale. Okay, and it starts to fall apart because my pivot points aren't placed accurately, and all the things we have to worry about when we're making a scalable rig, which we'll get into later in class. But anyway, that's just about everything you need to know about aim constraints, or constraints in general. That's the basics. And we'll make another tutorial another time covering the geometry, the normal, tangent. Well, actually, we'll probably just do the geometry and normal constraints. And those should cover just about every scenario you could ever come across.